Alors,
Bonjour et bienvenue. Merci de vous joindre à nous pour cette conférence par Barbara Fischer. Puisque la conférence d'aujourd'hui va avoir lieu en anglais, je vais dès maintenant changer de langue pour notre invité. Hello and welcome. Before we begin, allow me to acknowledge that this conference is being held on the ancestral lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I am grateful to the people who lived there here since immemorial time for welcoming us on this land and allowing us to study, think, research, and work. Today's lecture will be held in English. Please note that there will be a short question period at the end. As this lecture was organized for the class Rencontre avec les spécialistes, Meeting with Specialists, as part of the new short program in exhibition theory and practice, the discussion session following the lecture is reserved for students of the course. This short program was developed by Mélanie Boucher, professor of museology at École des Arts et Culture de l'UQO, and myself as part of a collaboration between the Art School and Galerie UQO. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to this conference, and it is a real honor for me to welcome Barbara Fischer for a conference entitled Ways of Looking at History. Barbara Fischer is the Executive Director, Chief Curator, Art Museum, and Associate Professor teaching stream at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto. Prior to her appointment at UFT, she held the curatorial position at Open Space Gallery, the Walter Phillips Gallery, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery. She was also the director of the Blackwood Gallery at UTM. In her curatorial work, Fischer focused on contemporary art and its histories. In her dual role as associate professor at the Daniels Faculty and director of the Art Museum, Barbara Fischer has led the Master of Visual Studies Curatorial Studies program, working with students to produce their graduating exhibition through the Art Museum at UFT. Her teaching focus has been on contemporary cultural and artist practice, with particular attention to the paradigmatic transformation of the field through the historical avant-garde, feminism, institutional critique, postcolonial, decolonial, and other historical and contemporary social culture transformation. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Mélanie Boucher and l'École des Arts et Culture de l'UQO. I'm also deeply grateful for my team at Galerie UQO and for the support of the Université du Québec en Outaouais. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the important support of the Conseil des Arts et des Lettres du Québec and la Ville de Gatineau. Barbara, thank you once again for accepting my invitation. The floor is all yours.
thank you so much, Marie-Hélène. It's truly a pleasure and an honor to be actually invited and to be able to talk about my curatorial work. Yeah, it's you run an amazing program, and the lecture series looked fantastic. It's really an honor to be here. So you're seeing the screen. I don't know actually if you see my face as well in the
Yeah,
Zoom
we
room.
see it.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Just so. So ways of seeing as a way of there's a subtitle to this. Ways of Seeing is, of course, a book that was published in 1972 by John Berger, really groundbreaking book, actually. I'm sort of riffing on that title by giving it a subtitle, Looking at History. And specifically, I am looking at the question of history within the framework of the museum and the type of institution that the museum is. I should just briefly say that I come out of a studio practice. I started as a visual artist in sculpture installation. I was very much of the time influenced by questions of postmodernism, a break with modernism in particular, specifically aesthetic modernism, as it was the sort of reigning paradigm of the time, coming at the question of art with issues of representation, feminism, as Marie-Hélène also, of course, introduced, and the sort of profound recognition that art is a social construction, that the self is a social construction, that institutions are social constructions, that there's nothing natural about them. And that is definitely something of a leitmotif. In other words, postmodernism as a framework that has influenced and is where my work comes from, or in which it is embedded in many ways. So I'm starting with just a very brief. So today I'm not going to talk about everything that I've done, but rather wanted to look at it at some exhibitions or some projects and some leitmotifs that have been there from the beginning in some ways, but that have also been modulated by thinking with others and by the thinking of others that has been very influential. One critical moment was for me when I, for the first time, entered into an official institution with a massive collection, the Art Gallery of Ontario, where I was an assistant curator. And the Art Gallery of Ontario, as many institutions in this country still, and of course internationally, is very much governed by an idea of art history that distinguishes specialists. That is where you have historical periods constructed by those who are charged with their stewardship, in other words, curators. And the field of art history is, of course, is kind of distinct from contemporary curating in that my peers at the AGO and at other institutions to this day will often be folks who have studied and have developed a PhD thesis on a particular period in art history that is considered specialist and that is often represented in collections in institutions to which the curator of contemporary art doesn't necessarily have the same kind of access, the same kind of pedigree, often the same kind of input, and so on. So for me, it was interesting entering into that space because the periods were all separated by curatorial expertise, and we were really not actually working together really at all. The contemporary curators were in one place, and the curator of European art was in another place, and so on. And that's a model that's still very much prevalent. It was a questionable model for me, and one of the first exhibitions that I did from the collection, which is often a job that the assistant curator will have, was to try to think outside of chronology, and but coming, of course, from feminism. So a project was called Traces of a Disappearance, the body in art. And so not the body in contemporary art, but the body in art. It could have been easily a major exhibition running right across the institution, but I only had one gallery space to work with. So I invited the sculpture by Rodin titled Adam, the Creation of Man from 1880 into an exhibition of contemporary art. And that's its figure. I don't have installation images because they're still in slides, and I haven't been able to transfer all of my slide archive into a digital sphere yet. But so I looked at this mythology of the creation of man as a kind of central structure, as a central image in the collections, and of course Adam as a kind of primordial figure created by God, directly by God, and the idea of the woman created from one of his ribs is a sort of structuring device that has governed so much in terms of iconography in art history. From feminism, we of course understand that the subject of art history is in many ways the male gaze, and it's the action of the male subject that determines so much of history that is actually father's time, that produces history. And here that was exemplified in the exhibition by a contemporary work by Dennis Oppenheim, who makes a dash across the sand, in other words, empowered sprint across territories, if you will, and leaves his footprint in the sand that he then cast in plaster, and the footprints are stacked up against the wall. So in other words, the landscape as marked by a male subject or sprinting across place and time was a particular construct connected to certain ideas of masculinity and masculinism also, if you will. I'm going to, because I have the feeling I'll be under time pressure with my images. In direct retort to Dennis Oppenheim's work, I included the work of Colette Whitten, who came into her own with a number of what she called structures that were, when you look at them, are kind of like scaffolds, but they also could be almost torture devices. And she specifically would invite her artist friends and male artists, whom she then strapped into these structures and made plaster casts from. So in other words, the body of her male friends would then become traced in plaster as a kind of sculpture, which is of course in a sort of primordial way, a kind of turning on its head the structure of art making, the structure of the representation of the body by coming from a female subject in this case. So this exhibition for me was a kind of a project where I felt this could take over the entire museum in a way, if one had the chance to work across disciplines and across time, against time, if you will, and draw into its orbit the question of gender, of masculinity, from a feminist perspective, and look at the history that is represented in the museum from a different lens. Of course, that was too big of a project, and I never got to do it. I wanted to now look at sort of a little bit of background and essentially start with the idea that of chronopolitics, the idea that history and time is a construct that in the museum is realized in very particular ways. In a sense, chronopolitics, as discussed by Fernando Esposito and Tobias Becker in 2023 in the Journal of History and Theory, writes how the study of chronopolitics essentially is the study of how power is exercised through the control, structuring, and perception of time. It analyzes who defines speed, like how quick we go, how slow we go, whether in terms of history, it's recording of history, but in our very everyday lives, questions of schedule, historical narratives, who decides what chapter of time is a history that is worthy of our attention and which are falling by the side ways, as well as future projections, right? The idea of how far you can go into the future and structure it is a kind of chronopolitics, especially when you think about 5-year plans, the strategic plan, and so on. So chronopolitics is very imbricated in everything that we do, and as curators, and how the museum is structured. And so I'm going to talk a little bit also about how I sometimes structure my teaching, which, as Marilyn also mentioned, is very much focused on certain paradigmatic shifts, again, having to do with the idea that the museum is not a natural construct. It was not always there. It is a recent construction, and it produces certain values. It is governed by a certain chronopolitic that was not always already in place. And I sometimes start my talk with the introduction to Peter Berger's idea of in his book Theory of the Avant-Garde, which is something to be looked at critically and so on. But he does begin his introduction to the social role of art by distinguishing the periods and practices that are in time, but not in diachronic time. That is, that are times that have been exceeded or are finished or concluded, but rather are not governed by temporality as a chronology. And that is, for instance, when he looks at the social role of art as a sacred practice, which exists in many cultures, many places, in very many different ways, but is distinguished by when we can say that art has the purpose to direct us to some other domain than the human made, insofar as it points us to a spiritual life, to the idea of afterlife, to the idea of what is outside of ourselves as times, as bodies, as places, as people. It has a spiritual role, and that could be whether it is around rituals of burial, whether it is rituals of exceeding even the human in animal human relations, in also distinguished actually in the way in which there is a certain integrity between the manifestations of cultural, let's say, for better or worse, objects. So I could defer, for instance, to something like the Stupa of Sanchi, which was built by King Ashoka. And it was one of the first major monuments to Buddhism. It holds the relics of Buddha under the semicircular dome. It is constructed in the round, so spherical often takes us to the idea of the firmament and the universe and the sky, but also inverted as burial place. It has 4 gates called the Toranas, aligned with east, west, north, south, and therefore pins to our attention to the cardinal points of where the sun rises, where the sun sets, and so on. So you can see this monument is really built up around certain ideas of the beyond human, and tries to be a meditative space where we glean something of this beyond human. In Christianity, there is, oops, I think a slide just jumped. One could also look, and this is in a sense, it looks immediately as a kind of prototype of the museum, but it is not per se. For instance, if one looks at Byzantine churches, this is the Basilica of Saint Apollinaire Nuovo in Ravenna, which was built by Theodore the Great as a palace chapel and comes from the 500s of the Common Era. And in a sense, it is a structure that it is narrative in that it tells the story of biblical time, if you will. The lines, the saints, in very specific registers, where you have at the top of the church the different parables and stories told by Jesus Christ, and below it is the sequence of the apostles, and right below that is the series of virgins who are led by the 3 magi to visit Christ the Savior in his glory. So it again, while it is actually in its first appearance looks like it is a museum, it is almost a prototype in that a museum might be understood as a housing that has sequences of images that tell certain stories about time. This is, of course, it relates itself to that what is beyond human time. It's the idea of the eternal, the idea of being much beyond what our own generation or our own lifetime might hold. And it has been so of time immemorial. Often it is understood that modernity is a break with this model of time, with this model of seeing things as a universe in which is governed by some type of spirit, whether it is a Christian God, whether it's Islam, whether it's Buddha, or any other figure that holds our spiritual universe together. And one of the figures that to me embodies this sort of sense of modernity blowing apart this sense of time and this sense of sort of, you could say, cohesion, for lack of a better word. And I want to temper it with maybe a bit of a crit, but just jumping over it is, of course, Walter Benjamin's amazing essay on Paul Klee's image of the angel of history, which kind of marks often, and in a sense you could see it almost as a metaphor for the idea of the curator. It is certainly meant to be a metaphor for the idea of the historian who sees, as Benjamin writes, and I apologize if you're all super familiar with it, which you probably are because it's so often recited, but it is worth looking at here perhaps to say that the image shows us an angel who is looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. And this is how Walter Benjamin pictures the angel of history, the one who looks at history. His face is turned toward the past, where we perceive a chain of events. Benjamin writes, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing in from the past, from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such a violence that the angel can no longer close the wings. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This is the storm that we call progress. It sums up, it encapsulates a little bit, I think, the paradigm shift that Nietzsche writes about, that the Enlightenment introduces into European history, where we are left to our own devices. Human thought begins to be constructed by itself and understands the crisis that introduces into sense of being and also cohesion. Now we are in a charge of history, if you will, and no longer is it a fate and or other time that determines us and our access to being, if you will. And more contemporary reflection is perhaps similar, I would say, an image that encapsulates that similarly is Maurizio Catalan's All exhibition, which was his retrospective in 2012, which shows time has exploded. Literally, it's no longer linear. It's not developmental. It doesn't have a beginning and an end. And it's the work by the artist who construes this sense of time, which is meant to be a retrospective, but is not, because there's no place that is the beginning and no place that is the end. So this is another kind of image, perhaps, for modernity that has been also so intensely worked through by the writer Zygmunt Bauman, and also by the work of Kodwu Eshun, who I'm hoping to invoke a little bit later on. This kind of explosion of belonging, where all ties that have defined community or hold community together is wrested apart, and industrialism, colonialism, empire building are all part of those forces. And today, of course, the digital. So the first museum, or credited to be the first museum, was kind of, hang on, for some reason, the PowerPoint is acting up a little bit. So Museum Wormiani, which was center, is in Denmark. It's actually been recreated today. I think those of you in museology will know it, of course, it's the beginning of the order of things as construed by human knowledge, right? And it's an attempt to make whole the dispersion that is the direct result of colonialism. And you can see that in the way in which the space is constructed. Sort of at the bottom, you have minerals. In the middle, you have organic materials that slowly become also animal species that at the time were new to the European eye. And then the human-made, which is rising or is in the top register, except for some of the largest animals. And you can see that it is because of colonialism, because it introduces, for instance, fruit and materials and objects that were not indigenous, if you will, in Europe. So this is a way of centering human knowledge as the construct by which the museum is made. And Foucault would have argued that this is sort of the microcosm of macrocosm. This is how the human understands its own role by way of organizing materials in some kind of structure that perhaps looks like the universe, but is, of course, made by the human ideas of knowledge. And I'm going to, sorry, move. The PowerPoint is a little staggering. I have the feeling it might be because, so as a next model of that, the development of that model, of course, is Pitt Rivers Museum that many of you also know was dedicated to the University of Oxford in 1884. And it essentially is this, and it's held to this day in the way that Pitt Rivers, an anthropologist and archaeologist, intended it to be seen, which is objects arranged in these different cases, and not in a way that we might recognize or how we would put these things together today, but nevertheless a kind of prototype in which the museum has developed, in the sense that, for instance, classifying objects by type that are then organized according to time and development. So this is where chronopolitics begins to really take a hold of the idea of how we think in the museum world, but how we think about time and history. History is an emergent model, right, that holds us to certain ideas, also politically speaking, to the idea of development and progress. In other words, how to make sense of how we develop as a species and how we develop, often seen through a technological lens. That is what the Pitt Rivers Museum stands for. If you haven't visited it before, it is sort of a shock when you go, because it confronts you with something, with this emergence of a model that is our model now, but has been multiplied and become, of course, intensified across everything that we do in museums in many ways, historically speaking. The model of how art history is then historicized is to this day the Louvre, seen to be a kind of master type, and I use that word for those reasons, of the history of art. And there was a recent article that was really interesting and I think very astute by Daniel Larkin in Hyperallergic, who revisits how the Louvre codified essentialism in art history. That is how it developed the history of art, according, of course, at the time in which it was born, which was the time of at first of the kings of France as a palace, serving as a palace, but then tipped at the point of the revolution to become the museum of the people and to become the museum of the history of art per se, in its most lavish, grandest conception, which I think a status that it still holds today. What is interesting, I want to just point to one little thing. Oh my gosh, time is really crunched. Chronopolitics. Just wanted to briefly put out the fact that what's still unusual is when one sees this model in the Louvre is that it still is actually tied to the body of the people in the sense that it is a history of the monarchy that has governed France for many centuries before the revolution, and it still holds that history, but as Linda Nochlin has argued, makes that history, which was a history of tyranny no less, transforms it magically into the history of the people. What is significant is that that history from before is actually preserved as capsules of historical moments inside of the Louvre, such as if you looked at the cycle of the Marie de Medici paintings, it's a cycle commissioned by Marie de Medici, one of the queens who describes her life and access to the throne in this incredible cycle of paintings. And it's preserved exactly as that and still holds today, of course, as a result of the conversion through the revolution where the monarchy was attempted to be extirpated once and for all, still holds a special place in the history, in the narrative, in the chronopolitics of the structure of the museum. And of course, where then this model distinguishes, and that is, I think, where many of the central museums still align with this, is the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art, the British Museum in London, the Tate in London, and so on. A kind of imperialism, the attempt after the French Revolution of not only account for its own history, but by way of, for instance, the figure of Napoleon, to go and plunder the many different provinces and territories and countries and spaces beyond France and bring treasures back, and to bring them back into the museum, where now they show us their displacement, and to come back to this sort of explosive aspect of modernity where they show up as fragments, right? It is astonishing if you think about it, how much the museum is composed of fragments of pieces from elsewhere, and how those fragments are what the curators have put into, or tried to put into, a chronopolitics that in the Louvre, of course, describes France as the pinnacle of cultural achievement, right? That's the job that Napoleon tried to deliver to the French people, that he tried to perform by bringing things from everywhere, by loosening from their pedestals and foundations, and dispersing them and bringing them into a new narrative, constructing a new narrative for them, the purpose of which was to establish grandeur. And this is very much a principle that underlies museums. Interestingly, is of course a huge amount of an intense amount of contestation, as you know, just recently, yesterday, in the papers, you had the article about France finally approving the restitution of some cultural objects that came to France, including the Louvre, from 1815 on, I think, to 1917 or something like that, signed into law, that restitution, this return of what had been taken from other places, is now a mandate of museums and so on. Interestingly, not those things taken by Napoleon, but there's a long backstory to that, and I don't need to get into that. An interesting case that is also very much in development is the British Museum with the Elgin marbles. You've heard that everyone who works in museology today works with that. But what I wanted to show is how the structure of this history is predicated on the bereftness of the one for the benefit of the other. And if we are looking at, for instance, the Acropolis as this ruin that from which things have been stripped, to when you look at the British Museum, built in its image, but now housing so many of the artifacts from the Parthenon, that you become aware of what the principle of chronopolitics really is and what distinguishes the center and metropolitan and the victors, if you will, of history from those who are considered the losers. And we don't have to talk about contemporary times to delve into that a lot. I'm going to skip over a couple of things because I'm quite behind there. I just wanted to bring one attention briefly to a museum that is currently sort of still in development, the Acropolis Museum in Greece, which was built adjacent to the Acropolis. And when you're inside of this new museum, you can see the temple that is bereft of its cultural objects, if you will, or the things that made it whole at some point, that were whole at some point. And you literally look through the glass of the new museum to see that temple, while this new museum houses the things that had fallen and were the ruined objects, if you will, from the temple. The temple is constructed in what is interesting is in the museum you can see where an excavation site is a way of trying to mine local history and to bring local history as the manifestation or as the core of the museum. And inside they have constructed the Parthenon in scale, including everything that is still present and is still in Greece, and where something is missing from that representation of the temple, they've included white plaster casts of those elements that are known to exist, but exist in different places. And they have labels to show that, for instance, oh, this piece is currently located at the Met in New York, or this piece is actually located at the British Museum in London. So it's a very different museum in this regard. It shows you not only what is still there from the narrative, but what is missing and where that missing piece went. And where we don't have a piece, it leaves it as a blank, as an absence. So it is a museum dedicated to the idea of what has happened in modernity, if you will, while trying to reassemble itself in a form of a representation. It's a very interesting construct, much to criticize, this idea of trying to make whole again. This is what Walter Benjamin describes, trying to make whole again, and what that means, complicated. We can talk about that. I'm reminded, when I think about that idea, is a piece by Tony Craig, a postmodern work that acknowledges this principle in some respects and tips its hat over to it. There's a broken bucket in front of it, and the artist has made a representation of this broken bucket in a flat space along the wall, but composed it of things that are from bits and pieces that are refuge and detritus that is found on the street, that is assembled, that just happens to be blue, so that you have this weird layering of what a representation is, and whether it is whole or not, and whether its source is a damaged piece to begin or not. Whatever is whole here is a really interesting, it can be a subject of an essay, I think, in view of what history is, what historicism is, how we as humans assemble to put back together what has fallen apart, and the ruptures that come with whatever we decide is progress, right? The things that are blasted asunder in order to grapple with how we might move forward from here, from a given place. Another beautiful descriptor of the question of objects in a museum and how it holds, and the contradictions of the museum, is, of course, Lawrence Wiener's beautiful, this is a terrible image, but it's a beautiful work called simply reproduced always in vinyl in different sizes, many things brought from one climate to another to make a grouping of things not related to the climate at hand. And you can think of this as objects, but you can think of this also as the question of immigration, diaspora, anywhere where a question of naturalization or being not a stranger or not being a foreigner or other in relation to the place at hand and what that means. So this is where it gets to be interesting. Instead of trying to make whole again, one of the opening salvos from a curatorial perspective was, of course, Harald Zeman's ahistorical exhibition, which was called Ahistorical Soundings, where at the Museum of Boinnigens, he was invited carte blanche by the director at the time to look at the collection against the grain of the logic of chronology or the logic of specializations and chronopolitics of those specializations, right? Because it is political in the museum. If you've worked in the big institutions, you know that disciplines don't often resist each other very actively because it's a protection of professionalization and expertise and all of that, which is Bruno Latour's work is so important in this regard around modernity and why we are maybe not modern enough actually by disregarding how much we actually ought to look at the present by way across disciplines and to understand what that means that we had become modern in a certain way. So Harald Zeman's was in a way the opening salve of going against the grain of chronology, against and what he tried to do was to assemble ways that resonated in the room with each other, as opposed to being classified or operating under classifications, like just disciplinary classifications. There's a big argument about this exhibition. The article provides some of that question. It was juxtaposed by Deborah Myers by this exhibition by Peter Greenaway, the filmmaker, called The Physical Self, produced in 1991, which centered the representation around the human body and therefore made it much more relatable, if you will, because we recognize the human body in representation. And all of the works from the collection here refer to the human body as a kind of baseline of perhaps insight, affect, a sense of relating to it that could exist outside of time and be a part of classifications that normally would govern our perception of time and history in the museum. Shortly within the year, we have this is probably one of the most significant exhibitions certainly of the 20th century by Fred Wilson. Everyone knows it, who studied art history, contemporary art, mining the museum, where this is exactly also what he begins. He looks at against the disciplines. He looks at the museum as a whole apparatus, no longer just simply of chronopolitics, but rather, yes, of chronopolitics in the sense of what has been included in the history and what is not included in the history. And what he finds is a lot of the mechanisms and systems by which exclusion was perpetrated by the museum, types of representation, types of histories that were valued, types of histories that were therefore excluded. It's very poignantly represented. Marie-Hélène, I'm cutting we're at literally 45 minutes. Do you think there's time for a little bit more?
Yeah, let's say another 10 minutes.
Okay. And I'm sure many of you know the work. It is so I think people recognize as soon as you show an image from Fred Wilson's work. It's mining the archive, and here in particular, he juxtaposes And forgive me, I need to look at this list. So he arranges pedestals of figures that he does find in the museum. And the portraits that he does find are virtually exclusively of white folk, here white men, who actually have nothing to do with Baltimore, where this museum is located. For instance, Napoleon Bonaparte. Who are the others? I forget now. But people not associated with Baltimore. And he installs three black pedestals directly to juxtapose this representation, and dedicates them to those to three people who are from Baltimore but are not recognized as part or a significant part of Baltimore history, even though they were historically so significant in terms of not history only of Baltimore, but for the U.S., including Harriet Tubman, an American abolitionist and social activist, Frederick Douglass, social reformer, abolitionist, orator, and then Benjamin Banneker, a free African American man who was also an abolitionist and an American naturalist, mathematician, etc., from the 1700s, passed away in 1806. So he juxtaposes what's missing, what's absent in this chronopolitics that the museum represents. So I'm going to clip forward really quickly. There have been a number of exhibitions that I feel we need to kind of still grapple with, because they also deal with the question of typology and what that can do by going against the grain of chronology. Here, Spring Herbert's really important project at the Royal Ontario Museum of Art from 2001, where she gathered 400 objects, all monochromatically white, organized in a way transhistorically, things that the project was called The Final Sleep. It dedicated or recognized the death that is so singularly part of the bedrock of the museum, what it holds: bones, skeletal remains of animals, the classification of animals, but she has rearranged them according to typology rather than species, for instance, to transcend the way in which normally the museum's classificatory principles are enacted. Important project, and you can see it was an astonishingly moving exhibition because it did reveal the extent to which the museum is a mausoleum, if you will, and in that sense connects us to a very specific desacralized idea of time, to which it tried to, I think this project tried to return us. Another important project within a year, the Teddy Bear Project, so-called, by Edessa Hendeles, first presented at the Edessa Hendeles Foundation in Toronto, where she had been collecting thousands of images that in one way or another contained the image of a teddy bear, sort of a prototype for human comfort in a desacralized world, if you will. This project happened in 2002. It was a massive, massive undertaking. And she points out that what she could find of the persistence of the teddy bear as a motif all across cultures, nations, histories, primarily from the late 19th century through to the present, was an emphasis on the family as a unit, the idea of clubs and other kinds of social aggregations where the teddy bear either functioned as a substitute child, such as a doll, or substitute sense of comfort, such as in military clubs and so on. But what was missing throughout, she found, were people who were not, for instance, or who, for instance, Down syndrome, or any other kind of physical disability and so on, that just didn't appear in this history. So it's a kind of anthropology of the human, which you could say was also at work in Peter Greenaway's exhibition. So and the typology outside of chronology becomes a way of anthropologizing the human, and a way of understanding our operations and our ways of being and our affections in the world. I'm going to flip over. So I didn't quite get to a lot of what I had intended to. A number of, I think in the last few years, my work has centered on giving artists, in particular of diaspora and those who would not be the center or the subject of agency or history in the museum context, to give them carte blanche to produce other histories or counter histories or alternative histories. And one of the first, no, I can't say first. I don't want to ever use the word first again. It's a ridiculous word. Every day there is a new first for this and all that. And we always have to remember first, there's no such thing as first, because we all come from somewhere and we all are, we're, we are part of something, rather than the progenitor of something, I would say. And here, Deanna Bowen, for project she did for the anniversary of Hart House, where our gallery is also located, where she wanted to look back at the history of Hart House, but also the role it had played, culturally speaking, in the development of some of the most important institutions in Toronto, that then also had an impact nationally. For instance, the figure of Vincent Massey, who was charged with the Royal Commission for the Arts, out of whose work comes the National Library, the Canada Council, and so on. As a central figure in early 20th century, he was, of course, the donor of Hart House as a building to the university. In other words, the DNA of that history and of the folks around him, the constellation of people, bankers, professors, writers, artists, including the group of seven, performed a network that, however, and as Deanna Bowen points out in this, and which really led to this huge blowout at the National Gallery, the panic around her work, to understand how much it was predicated on not only racism as a practice, such as in blackface, practices of red face, the theater produced plays along these lines, but also fundraising events that were centered on explicit racist stereotypes, but also were, of course, meant significantly the exclusion of racialized artists, people of color, in the story of history that was produced from the early 20th century to in the museum context, well into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And we still are attempting to walk back from, understand differently, desegregate, undo, and produce differently. A major exhibition that some of you may have seen was by Kent Monkman, called Shame and Prejudice, in which he literally, and to my knowledge, kind of made a history of Canada of the last 150 years through an Indigenous lens, literally chapter by chapter, from the period of the Rococo, which was the explosion of colonialism and the takeover of lands and territories, but through the lens constructed by his alter ego, Mischief, Eagle Testicle, and literally he carried the voice of the entire exhibition, creating a new narrative, which in my opinion, should have become a new museum of the Canadian history. If we could rewrite outside of the existing chronopolitics, the story of how our museums produce histories, I think that this might be a very good model that projects itself into the future by way of the imaginary art produced differently, the idea of history, time, and so on. So I think I'm out of time, right?
Yes, it's almost that. Maybe if you have one last word or something you want to present, but yeah, we are almost.
Um, Different models of time are emerging, and I had hoped to be able to get to an exhibition we recently did by Camille Turner, which was dedicated to unsilencing the past and staging Black Atlantic memory. It's something that tries to model also temporality different, so taking it out of chronology, but trying to think of time as recurrence, as rhythm, as water, as ebb and flow, where the water carries memory, where rocks carry memory, and therefore goes outside of the chronopolitics that have determined so much and centered so much of our work in museums. So that's the last word.
Thank
So
you
those.
so much. Thank you so much, Barbara. It was a wonderful. I didn't want you to stop.